Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the false analogy or faulty analogy fallacy. An analogy is normally quite a good way of building an argument. It involves comparing two things in order to illustrate important properties of one of them. So, learning to write well is like riding a bike. It requires practice, and the more you do it, the more proficient you become. That's not a great, insightful, interesting, dazzlingly brilliant analogy, but it highlights a particular component of learning to use rhetoric, that this is a skill, and as a skill, it takes practice. You don't immediately excel at it, and as you continue to use it, you get better at it, right? So this is basically how analogies work. It's a structure of argument, a logos technique. A false analogy or faulty analogy is when two things are compared that aren't comparable, or aren't comparable in the way that the author is comparing them. So basically, as with all logical fallacies, this is a breakdown in the structure of the argument, right? So if I were to say to you, rhetoric is like a 3-course meal. You have to eat with the right fork for the right course. You would say, what the fuck are you talking about? That's a terrible example, but a faulty analogy is going to set up something. It's going to set up a comparison that will potentially sound convincing, but there's something fundamentally wrong with the comparison. And so it undermines, or it fails to properly illustrate the thing that you're trying to properly illustrate. So I would argue, for instance, that there's this very common idea in the US in politics, that government should be run like a business. That's actually a simile because it uses like or as, but you get my point. Government should be run like a business. I would argue that this is a faulty analogy because the fundamental objective of a business is different from the fundamental objective of government. Sure, there's some things that may be similar about them. Principles like wasting money is a bad idea, you should hire the right people for the job, etc., etc. But they're really at such a broad, bland level that doesn't tend to make for a compelling argument. If, however, you conceptualize, if you think about what this analogy would actually mean, it would suggest that the purpose of a government is to make profit, to make as much profit as possible by providing goods and services to customers. That's what a business does. Fundamentally, strip away every other specific thing about an individual business. Its fundamental objective is to make as much money as possible by providing goods or services to customers who pay for them. A government's fundamental objective is not that. I mean, a kleptocracy maybe. If you have a government of and by thieves, sure. But typically that's regarded as a bad form of government. In a country like the United States, where we have representative democracy, the goal of a representative democracy is not to make as much money as possible by providing goods or services to customers who pay for them. The objective is to be responsive to the needs of citizens. So fundamentally, it's a bad analogy, right? Do you see how that works? What we have here is an analogy that, rather than illuminating a characteristic of the thing being discussed, government, the nature and purpose of government, actually obscures it. Because the analogy doesn't properly illustrate information about the topic itself, it makes it harder to actually understand the point that's being made or the key information, rather than making it easier to understand. So this is the problem with false analogy, is that it looks like it's doing the thing that an analogy is supposed to be doing, when in fact it is doing the opposite. Rather than illuminating the subject under discussion, it obscures it through a bad comparison. A comparison that does not properly tell us useful or true information about the subject.